Okay, folks, welcome. So we're going to be talking through the basics of Kant's ethical theory. Not a lot of the resources online are doing quite the job I want them to, so I just decided that I'm going to talk through these things for you. So let's get to it. So here's the plan for today. In part one, in the first video that I'm going to make, we're going to talk about the difference between categorical and hypothetical imperatives, and we're also going to talk about Kant and his principle of, just clicking back there, his principle of universalizability. And then in the second video, I'm going to talk about the principle of humanity. So, first important idea for Kant. It's the distinction between categorical and hypothetical imperatives. So the idea of an imperative, the word imperative just means a thing you have to do, right? So these are kind of like commands of reason for action. And here's how Kant thinks about it. He says that a categorical imperative doesn't depend on what you care about or desire, whereas a hypothetical imperative does depend on what you care about or what you desire. So to think up an example of a hypothetical imperative, we might think of, wanting to, let's say, be a certain weight. If you're trying to watch your weight, then you have a particular desire, right? And then you're going to have to do certain things. So you're going to have to watch your diet or exercise in the right way to maintain the right weight. Now, the idea is if you didn't care about your weight at all, then you wouldn't have any rational obligation to exercise, right? And you can think about other things as well. So if you want to have money, it's a hypothetical imperative that you should get a job or not spend your money foolishly. Now, Kant, his idea is that there's this other kind of imperative. It's a thing that you rationally have to do all the time, no matter what your desires are, right? So no matter what you care about, there are some things that you have to do as a matter of reason. And Kant thinks that our moral duties are categorical imperatives, right? You have to do the morally right thing, whether or not that's what you desire to do, whether you care about morality at all. So that's sort of like the first big idea for Kant. It's this idea of morality as a categorical imperative. You have to do the morally right thing, no matter what your desires happen to be. We've gotten a little error here. Go back to presenting. So, sorry for that little hiccup there. So, how do we figure out what our categorical imperatives are? Well, Kant tells us that there are different formulations of the categorical imperative. So that basically means there's different ways of articulating what your moral duties are, no matter what. So the first formulation of the categorical imperative is what he calls the principle of universalizability. So when you think about the categorical imperative and the principle of universalizability, you might think that it's about the golden rule, right? This famous ethical idea that says, treat others as you would like to be treated. This is an idea that has popped up in many cultures and within many traditions. But that is not Kant's idea. He says that the golden rule doesn't make any sense because it doesn't depend on what you happen to desire. So, for instance, let's say you were a masochist, right? A masochist is a person who likes for others to hurt and belittle them, right? Well, the idea that we can learn from Kant is that you have a moral responsibility to treat others well, independently of whether you desire to be belittled or not. And you don't get to start belittling people just because you have a particular desire for being hurt and belittled, right? So it's not about the golden rule. Okay, so if the golden rule doesn't explain what we should do morally, we're going to have to come up with a slightly different theory. So related to this idea of the categorical imperative that morality applies to you whether you care about it or not, Kant also thought that it applies to everybody equally, right? There's like one set of moral rules and nobody is a special exception to the moral rules, right? So within that same line of thought, we can say that acting immorally is about making yourself an exception to the rules. So morality is going to be all about unfairness. So Kant gives us the principle of universalizability, and it says this. It says an action is morally acceptable if and only if, so that just means exactly when and only when, its maxims are universalizable. So that's not going to really tell you much if you don't understand the concept of maxims and universalizability. So just to build out from that, we can say that a maxim is the principle that you give to yourself when you're acting, and it states what you're going to do and why. So the idea here is that, intentional human behaviors are different than simply bodily movements, right? A choice that you make is something different than a movement that you make in your sleep, or the digestion that goes on in your body involuntarily, right? So the difference between something that happens to you and something that you do, one of your actions, is your intentions. So the fancy word that Kant uses is a maxim, right? So it's like a plan of action, kind of like a rule that you give yourself, and why, right? All right, so we're saying you have to have the right kind of plan of action in order to do an action that's morally acceptable. So here's how we can build out from this. Consider the example of cutting in line at the coffee shop in order to save yourself some time. You consider the maxim, and it might be something like this. I will cut in line at the coffee shop, and then why, right? In order to save time. Now, here's where we get to the thought about universalizability. Kant says that if everybody cut in line, there'd be no line at all. It would just be a mob, right? So the thought that Kant has is that when you act from a maxim that's not universalizable, you're making an exception of yourself. And that's just completely antithetical to the idea of an absolute morality that applies to everybody all the time, right? So just to note here, when we start thinking about whether a maxim is universalizable, we're not thinking in terms of the sorts of utilitarian justifications that we looked at last week. It's not about whether the world would be made a worse place if everybody followed a rule. So, you could think about how sometimes we reason like this. We might think that it's not okay to walk across the quad because if everybody were to walk across the quad, on campus, then it would ruin the grass, right? So that's saying if everybody did this thing, things would turn out bad. That's not what Kant is saying. What Kant is saying is that when you fail to follow the principle of universalizability, you're making yourself an exception to the rules. The rule that you're giving to yourself isn't a rule that everybody could adopt and follow. So for Kant, the idea, how do you know what to do? Well, the idea is first, you just need to formulate your maxim clearly, state what you intend to do and why. Then you imagine a world in which everybody supports and acts on that maxim. And then you ask, can the goal of my action be achieved in such a world? And if your answer is yes, then your action is morally permissible. And if your action is not universalizable, then it's morally impermissible, right? And moreover, for Kant, it's a certain kind of irrationality, right? This making yourself an exception to the rules is irrational in a certain kind of sense. Now, it's not irrational in the sense of hypothetical imperatives, right? It could be perfectly rational in one sense to rob banks, right? If you think that that's the best way to get yourself some money. But what Kant is saying is that there's a special kind of irrationality. It's one kind of irrationality that's involved with acting immorally and thereby in acting in ways that are not universalizable. So that's the idea, right? So we can explain all sorts of morally wrong things in terms of this principle, whether it be things like lying or cheating or stealing. So for instance, if everybody had the maxim of lying, then you wouldn't be able to achieve your goal of deceiving a person, right? Words would be worth nothing in a world where lying, whenever convenient, was a universalized maxim, right? So this is supposed to be the thought, right? If we try to think about making the world the most fair place that it can be, we might think that this principle of universalizability that Kant has given us can help us to articulate that thought. We might also notice that there could be some potential problems with the principle of universalizability. So here's the example that Schaefer-Landau gives us in the text. He says that a principled fanatic's actions might actually be universalizable. So the idea of a fanatic in Schaefer-Landau's sense is a person who is super committed to a particular goal or principle, and is also even willing to use violent means to achieve what they think is important. So, for example, you might have a religious fanatic who thinks that all people who engage in homosexual conduct should be killed. Now, this is obviously a bad principle of action, right? We think that it's really wrong to kill people for being gay. Of course, it's wrong to kill people in general, but especially on the basis of sexual orientation, we would think. But the fanatic might say, look, if I had committed these things that they believe to be sinful, then they might consistently say that they would deserve to die too. So the thought here is that the fanatic could have their principles fulfilled even if everyone were to adopt them, right? So the idea is like you could have a commitment of a Nazi or a homicidal maniac or a religious fanatic who actually passes the Kantian universalizability test, which is just, could everybody adopt that maxim that they have and achieve their aim? So that's one problem with the principle of universalizability. So basically what it's doing is it's saying things that are actually wrong are okay by the standards of the theory. So there's Schaefer-Landau. So basically he says that, with this case that he's given us, it suggests that acting on a universalizable maxim might not be sufficient for moral rightness. Another problem that we might encounter here is that there might be certain actions that are perfectly okay to do, but that they are in fact not universalizable. So this is a way of saying that rather than universalizability is insufficient for moral rightness, we might also say that it's not necessary for moral rightness. So you might think of a universalizable maxim, or you might think of a maxim, that is not universalizable, but which is perfectly morally okay. So the example I've given you here is of the person who goes to the grocery store only when it's not busy. Well, wait a second. Could everybody go to the grocery store only when it's not busy? Well, if everybody did that, then the not busy times would become busy times, or there would just be no such thing as a busy time anymore. Another example might be like going to use the tennis courts when they're empty. Well, you can't have everybody adopt and act on the maxim, go and use the tennis courts when they're not busy. One last problem case in a similar vein. When we look at this test here, it says that we ask, can the goal of my action be achieved in a world where everybody is trying to do the same thing? Well, it seems like there are other cases where, say, in sport, both teams try to win, right? But the goal of winning cannot be achieved by everybody in such a world. Now, there might be an interesting technical question here. Is it that the goal of your action needs to be achievable by everyone with the maxim, or just one person with the maxim? So I'm just going to leave that as like a question that you might think about as maybe something to puzzle over as you try to work out whether a plausible theory of Kant's ethics can be worked out. So one last thought is about absolute moral rules. So remember, Kant thinks that morality is a categorical imperative, and it applies to you whether or not you have any desire to follow the moral law. It always applies to you. But even furthermore, Kant tells us that there are certain moral rules, such as his prohibition against lying, that is absolute, that it's never permissibly broken, right? No matter when you have an opportunity to lie, Kant thinks it's always wrong. He says it's even wrong to lie to a would-be murderer about the location of their victim. Now, one argument, and you'll see this in the crash course video, which is also on Moodle, one of Kant's claims seems to be that if you lied to the would-be murderer, and then they used that misinformation and ended up finding their would-be victim, then the murder would be on you. I think that's a bit of a strange argument. But we'll remember the other argument from universalizability, right? It's just the thought that if everybody lied all the time, then no lie would ever be successful. And so by lying, you are adopting a maxim that couldn't be adopted by everybody. So you're making yourself an exception to the rules. Now, against this line of thought, Schaefer-Landau points out that the principle of universalizability doesn't require saying that lying is wrong always and forever. Schaefer-Landau says that there are uncountably many maxims that permit lying, right? So you might say, I will lie in order to save a life. I will lie in order to make some money. And Schaefer-Landau just points out that that to have an absolute moral prohibition on lying, it would require every single maxim permitting a certain type of action would fail this test of universalizability. This is a further question that you could think about, whether lying is the sort of thing that's sometimes okay, whether it's never okay, and whether Kant's theory that is all about having universalizable maxims maybe could be made consistent with sometimes lying. Schaefer-Landau seems to think that actually you could adopt a universalizable principle that permits lying, which might be something like lie in cases where the stakes are super high and you need to prevent a grave moral wrong from happening. Now, Kant himself would have argued against that, but I'll leave it up to you, as I said, to think about whether there's a good argument to be had on one side or the other. Okay, so we're going to stop here for this one, and then we're going to pick up with the second formulation of Kant's categorical imperative in part 2 of this video. All right, thanks for listening, folks. Bye.